So, good morning or good evening, or everyone. We are here for the second HIFA seminar that we started a month ago, so successfully, with 650 participants last time, and I'm so glad to say that given the speaker, given the title he proposed and we welcomed, today we have with us Professor Begot from University of Bordeaux for a very timely title that we can first read in Italian on causality and sorry, I'm speaking English. Causalità e casualità in English sounds causality and chance in recent pharmacovigilance signals of COVID-19 vaccines. What evidence for public health decision? So let me briefly introduce Professor Begot, who is an old friend of us, and as I'm saying, also Giuseppe Traverse and other colleagues, that forced somehow Professor Begot to accept such a timely and demanding title of discussing the current situation of understanding extremely rare, severe adverse event from some or of the available vaccines for COVID-19, in which we are all in and deeply involved. Professor Begot is a true professor of pharmacology and pharmacovigilance. True, I mean, we all appreciated this publication and learned a lot also from some of its textbooks and chapters on pharmacoepidemiology in particular, that he made a modern disciplines around 20 years ago when we mixed the previous methods, more analytical from pharmacovigilance systems into the new large database science, real world evidence, propensity score, and other sophistication that our colleagues and statisticians are now able to perform. He has had a long career, and his center in Bordeaux is one of the reference centers in Europe and in the world for what they developed in the 20 years from when he established the center to the recent activities. And also some of our good Italian young colleagues are also working there with our great satisfaction. He has published a lot in the field. More than 300 publications are indexed on PubMed, and again, very active in clinical pharmacology and in the famous Bordeaux seminars that they have been running for quite a while. I don't want to be too long, but let me thank again Professor Begot or Bernard for accepting this invitation. Thanks to all of you for this highly participated meeting. I think we will have an extremely interesting and dense and comprehensive presentation. Feel free to send your questions that will be evaluated if possible. And just a final little explanation. The presentation will be split into two, and we'll have a pause with some questions after the first part before moving to the second one. So thanks again, Bernard, and the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Grazie mille, Dottore Magrini. Grazie mille. To begin with, I would like to thank you intensely for having me invited to participate in this incredibly successful webinar. Thank you. The success is yours. It's not it's the title. It's the prestige of the agency, not my name. Clearly, the subject of my presentation today is both hot and difficult. My challenge will be not to disappoint you and if possible, to show how simple statistical calculations can provide very useful information for public health decisions. So thank you again. So next slide, please. Okay, so I would like to start by killing the suspense. And just, it is very important not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because clearly conception, development, and marketing within less than 1 year of anti-COVID vaccines will remain anyway one of the biggest successes of modern pharma. Next slide, please. So the two questions I have to try to treat are, first, was the occurrence of cases of venous thrombosis, for instance, after vaccination coincidental or at least in part causal? And based on this response, is the benefit-risk balance of the vaccine still excellent? Next, please. Okay, so a difficult question, causal or coincidental, it is always a debate. And answering the question is the purpose, what we call causality assessment or imputability. There is three different situations. The first, next slide, please, are self-evident causal relationship. For instance, you see one guy on the left, healthy person, and on the right, the same person 2 minutes after injection of 1 dose of vaccine. Here, the causal relationship, the link between the vaccine and the event is obvious, because nobody can explain something bizarre like this. More seriously, self-evident causal relationship could be the case, for instance, of anaphylactic shock or seizures during or just after injection of a dose of vaccine or intake of a drug. Next slide, please. But in the majority of cases, for instance, answering the question is much more difficult. So we need step-by-step approaches. We need specific methods, and we have two groups. The first is to work at the individual level, and the second is to work at the population level. So for the individual level, it's what we call case-by-case analysis. So we review the cases of adverse drug reaction, and we try to determine the probability of responsibility of the drug. It could be done by, it's the most frequent, by expert judgment, global introspection. It could be a single expert reviewing the cases, saying yes, no, probably, perhaps, certain, and so on. Or a group of experts working together or separately. Or the best approach is probably a group of experts working separately and then working according to a Delphi process in order to solve all the disagreements, and we obtain something very robust. The second approach for individual level are algorithms. That is to say, operational decision trees, for instance. You have to answer a given number of questions, and at the end, you obtain an indication about the probability of responsibility of the drug in the occurrence of the event. So we have at least 30 algorithms published in the scientific literature. The third approach is more sophisticated, is to use the probability distribution and to try to calculate very precisely the degree of responsibility or the probability of responsibility of the drug. For instance, 55%. It could be done by using Bayesian statistics, for instance. And some years ago, we developed a model based on the logistic model, the logit, and it works well too. Next slide, please. Now, at the group or population level, we will use statistics, and we have, of course, two quite different approaches. Experimental plans, that is to say clinical trials, pragmatic trials. So it's the only design without any suspicion of confounding for control, ideally for confounders, and observational approaches, classical approaches, such as cohort studies, case control studies, self-control design, and so on, and simplify pharmacoepidemiologic approaches. The case population, for example, we have developed something like this for the safety surveillance in the framework of vaccination campaign, and observed versus expected. Next slide, please. Okay, this observed versus expected is a very interesting approach. And probably the European Medicine Agency made reference to this approach when the agency said the number, for instance, for the AstraZeneca vaccine, the number of thromboembolic events reported in vaccinated people seems not higher than seen in the general population. I would like to illustrate the principle of such a comparison. Next slide, please. Okay, so for explaining the approach, I will take the statistics published by the European Agency on April 7th for the AstraZeneca vaccine. We had 62 cases of cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. I will call them CVSTs. And for an estimated number of people vaccinated, around 25 million. So here the question we have to answer is how many cases of thrombosis were expected to occur by chance in this population if not vaccinated during, for instance, a given interval of time. For answering this question, we need the size of the population, so it's clear, it's 25 million, and one idea of the frequency of the disease in the population. This could be provided by the baseline incidence of, for instance, CVST in the general population. And after a quick literature review, I found discrepant estimate, but not too much discrepant, with a ratio of 3 only. One low estimate of 5 per million and per year, and two published in Struck about 14 per million and per year. Next slide, please. So if I take this, I see that I can calculate the number of coincidental cases I would have observed in the population without any vaccination. So I take the 25 million and I apply the baseline risk. For the low estimate, 5 per million, I obtain 125 cases. And for the high estimate, published in Struck, of 14 per million, I obtain 350 cases. Wonderful. The observed number is 2 to 6 times lower than expected from chance in the vaccinated population. So it's a very, very good news. Next slide, please. In fact, it is not, because just for explaining the process, 3 serious methodological errors have been made. The first, next slide, please, is to forget the inescapable underreporting. It is clear that, next slide, pharmacovigilance system, even if very active, never catch all the cases of adverse reaction in a given population. We only catch one part of the cases. And several studies conducted, for instance, in France, I am chauvinist, in UK, USA, have shown that on average, 5%, 1 for 20, 5% of cases are on average reported to pharmacovigilance system. It is very difficult to appraise the magnitude of underreporting in a given case, but we can be certain that probably when we observe 62 cases, we have much more cases in the population. For instance, 5 to 10 times greater would be sensible. Next slide, please. We have developed all the approaches to try to determine the magnitude of underreporting and how to control for in a specific book. Next slide. The second error was using an inflated denominator, because when you calculate a rate, there is a basic principle that, for instance, the person included in the denominator, the 25 million vaccinated, should be a priori have the same chance presenting the event. And this was probably not the case here, because here you see the incidence of CVST according to age, and we see that, for instance, is much more frequent in young persons, when probably for the denominator, the 25 million people, probably, at least in some countries, such as France, for instance, the majority of people vaccinated were over 60. So we have here probably a problem not controlled for. Next slide, please. But the third and more severe mistake, error, was using inconsistent time window in my previous calculation. Because observed versus expected comparison should be made on a predefined and relevant time window. Okay, we agree. But on the same time window, for instance, if the 22 or 26, what do you want, thrombosis cases were observed within the 2 weeks following injection of a dose of vaccine, the relevant question was how many CVSTs were expected anyway in the absence of vaccination during this 2 weeks interval. And it was a fallacy to use a 2 week for the cases and 1 year for the reference. So I am obliged to compare the expected number and the observed number for the same time interval, that is to say 2 weeks, and I have to forget using the annual incidence. Next slide, please. So if I consider 2 weeks, it could be 1 month if some case have occurred, for instance, with a longer delay. It's just for the computation. But if all the cases were observed after 2 weeks after injection, I will consider 2 weeks. In this case, the relevant incidence is not 5 per million and 14 per million, but 26 times lower. So that is to say 0.2 and 0.5 per million. Under this condition, and this correct condition, the number of coincidental cases are not 125, but 5, and not 350, but around 14. Next slide, please. And doing so, we see that we have probably a signal because 5 to 14 cases were expected by chance for a 2 week time window. We can play with 1 month, 3 weeks, or what you want. And we observe 62, that is that is to say between 4 and 25 more. So it's significant. For instance, if we apply here a comparison based on the Poisson distribution. So here I would conclude that we have a signal, but of course we are in the case of spontaneous reporting. Many things remain unknown, and this signal should be strengthened by, for instance, case-by-case assessment or analysis, by a careful review of biological plausibility to try to know, is it plausible that such a vaccine could induce cerebral thrombosis, and of course, more robust pharmacoepidemiologic approaches. But just before ending this first part, this ratio here did not consider underreporting, so probably things could be worse. So thank you for your attention. I hope it was not too fuzzy, hazy, unclear, or what you want. And if we have time for questions, I will be very pleased to try to answer them or to discuss some points. Thank you, Dr. Magrini.
Dottor Magrini dovrebbe accendere il microfono.
Sì.
Sorry, Bernard, I was speaking by myself, unmuted. So thanks a lot for this very clear reconstruction on how we can be able to perceive signals of severe rare events. You showed it with a special capacity that I think has made possible for us all to understand the main perspective of an optimal approach to see a difference between observed and expected cases. I see already some questions coming on the right that maybe could probably be kept for the very end, because they tend to go for the overall risk-benefit balance, or how we can improve also in other countries. Let me add one more. Do you think that the last week, if not panic, last week news that also Johnson & Johnson was sharing an even smaller single in the US can be approached in the same way as FDA and CDC have done just yesterday and the day before? What do you think?
Yeah, my answer would be yes. The question was about this family of vaccines. So we were expecting to see whether other adenovirus vaccine could share the same effect. You know that in the USA, people are very fast. They react after 6 cases. And it is due to probably many factors, including probably forensic and lawyers aspects. But I think that you can apply such computation even if the number of cases is very low. And I know that, for instance, in the CDC and people in the FDA are very familiar with this type of approach. I don't know if they publish them, but they often calculate what was expected, what we observed. They compare with characteristics of the population using a case population approach. The scientific level in the US is very good. Just if you give me the opportunity to make a point clear from my presentation previously, the statement of the EMA, it was not a criticism, just a game to take the statistics. When the EMA said the rate it was not higher, it was on March 10th. And I used the statistics for April 7th. I did not use the statistics of March 10th because for me, I don't know for you, I did not have the details on the 30 cases of thrombosis, what was splanchnic, what was cerebral, and so on. So for me, it was impossible to try to play with. But my answer will be yes to your question.
A couple of questions. One related to your mentioning underreporting as an issue. And do you think that for such severe events, such as clinically a stroke or an unexpected severe event, usually in a young woman, that's what we're talking about, could have the usual large underreporting of 1 in 20 or one every 10 that you mentioned, or what's your view on that?
Okay, so this is an excellent question. I think nobody can answer. Now, in fact, when I say 5%, it was a study conducted in Europe, another one in the USA, for instance, but it was average, including severe cases, including when media interest is present, as it is the case here. But of course, I am not stupid. I do think that it probably, the underreporting is not as large as 95%. So it will be ridiculous. But I am quite certain, in fact, that probably when all the cases are not or were not reported. I'm very old, as you see, and I am working in pharmacovigilance for 40 years, and sad story, for 40 years. And I can testify that I never met a single affair, even if the cases are severe, occurring in children or young women with the media and the TV, a single affair where we catch spontaneously 100% of the case. So probably here, the actual number of cases is greater than 22 or 26, but I don't know how many. It could be 100, I don't know. So after, it could be, it is possible, but it's rather difficult to try to use, for instance, recapture technique to appraise the importance of the underreporting in this precise case. But we are in Europe with very different countries, and probably the reporting was quite different in Italy and other countries, for instance. Okay, so it's very difficult to answer, but probably we have underreporting, but not 5%. So okay.
And thanks a lot for your broad view and your experience. Another question that could be somehow the opposite of this one, sort of a swinging the pendulum. Are we on the alarming side? Are we on the reassuring side? That I appreciated your mentioning the excellent benefit risk ratio, not just good. So, how do you judge the idea that we are dealing with, if not 1 in a million, 1 in every 100,000? We are all old enough that 25 years ago we had the tremendous interesting discussion on second and third generation oral contraceptive, when the expected third generation should have been safer and were probably more thrombogenic, that we discovered in a range that is probably higher than the event we're talking about. And third generation pill are perfectly on the market, are perceived as safe, and so forth, and are similarly given to healthy young women. So moving from good calculations that you showed as how to provide reliably to give an estimate, what do you think is the actual size of the problem, also in terms of bringing a message that in this, how to say, with good American language, unprecedented participation and media coverage, not easy then to deal with what you've been teaching for a lot of time, risk communication and risk perception. This is a perfect case where an extremely rare risk, severe, can be perceived as an overwhelming alarm.
Yeah, it is again an excellent question. It could be the topic of an entire seminar, webinar, because, as you know, vaccines are killed not by safety or figures, but by communication or communication errors. The comparison with third generation oral contraceptive is excellent for many reasons. The first, because we think that the mechanism could be more or less common with probably in some aspects. Secondly, it is possible that oral contraceptive, not the third generation, but oral contraception could be a risk factor for the cerebral thrombosis occurring after vaccination in a young woman. We don't know, but we expect the answer from the European agency. And it is very sad to observe possible severe or serious or fatal cases in young people, and in this case, young women. But the two affairs are different, because for the third generation pills, it was misuse, misprescription. In France, at least, we know that this oral contraceptive was second line prescription, and in fact, it was prescribed first line in many women. And you can kill, in this case, a woman for not nothing, but the advantage of the third or fourth generation compared to second was very, very low. So you have no, there is a scandal killing somebody for almost nothing. In the case of vaccines, it is quite different. We are it's a war against one of the worst virus we had for 1 century. So we need vaccines. So it is not cosmetic. But it's not. We have no alternative therapies, or we have no drug effective on the infection, for instance. So we need to keep the vaccines, but we need to use the vaccines in the population where the benefit risk is probably the better. Okay. So it is the purpose of statistical calculation to try, and the regulatory decision to try to place the good vaccine in the good population, because it will be a disaster if we had an increase in vaccine hesitancy, and for instance 55% of the population refused to be vaccinated because the TV are presenting cases of death in young women. It would be a disaster. So it's many things are common for these two affairs, but we not feel the benefit, in fact. I'm sorry, I was not very clear because it was the time for coffee, but I forget the coffee. So I was not very clear in my answer.
I feel truly grateful. I think you've been clearer than many of our press releases up to now. And also in Italy, I have to admit, we can probably have some self-criticism for how we managed the different periods of the campaign. As you know, AstraZeneca vaccine was introduced in both Italy and France, restricting age at the beginning, the younger, and now moving to the opposite side for things we know.
Yeah, exactly the same in France. We have the same. because the European agency or with the French agency say this vaccine should be used in the young people because we have no evidence of effectiveness in older population. And now we are saying, please use it in the older population because it's not safe in the young people. So for the population and the media, it's difficult to follow.
Yeah. Would you like to comment on this? I myself have had some personal reflections. How do you judge this evolution over time, and what's your view?
It's very difficult because we have, for instance, for the vaccine, all the clinical. I'm sorry, it was personal opinion. Don't be shocked by my response. We are always fascinated by clinical trials, but so it's for me it's unbelievable to see why the clinical trials for these vaccines, that is to say Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, included only a small proportion of older persons over 70, for instance. Because 1 year ago, it was perfectly evident, that probably the target population will be people over 70s. So the first mistake with the Astra was when we opened the trial, we don't see evidence that it was active in very old people. So by the precautionary principle, the agency said, no evidence, so no use, please use in the young people. And it may be one reason why we observed some signals in the young, I don't know, because this vaccine remained in the older population, maybe where the central cerebral thrombosis is very rare, infrequent. I don't know, but it was a very sad story. For me, it's not a success for the trials because the trials did not answer many points. First, the efficacy for over 70 years of age, the direction of the protection, what happens, for instance, if I don't respect the 3 weeks between two doses, and so on. So we were obliged to search the answer in observational studies, for instance, in Scotland and in Israel. And for me, it's a victory because we suffered during 20 years the dictator of evidence-based medicine, and we have in the hand that only randomized clinical trials were the truth, and observational studies were garbage, nothing. And now we see the same persons obliged to go to observational studies in order to obtain some response to the major question we have with the vaccine. So I think it's a big lesson for, and I hope that it will reposition observational and pharmacoepidemiology at a higher level of credibility.
Thank you, let me say, Professor Begor, for the maximum respect. Truly, I think your vision also on using or overusing clinical trial evidence from randomized trial has been extremely wise and able to provide the necessary balance between what we need and what we have. So we can move on to the second part of your presentation.
More difficult.
Yes, but please, it would be a pleasure.
Okay, so thank you again, Dr. Magrini, and grazie mille, 10 mille. So the second part will be the benefit-risk balance, and I will try to make some statistics here, or statistical calculation, and just it is a game. And again, I start from the European Medicine Agency statement. When the agency say to be firmly convinced, I was surprised by convinced because we expect facts or results. no opinion, but okay. So he said to be firmly convinced that the benefit of the AstraZeneca vaccine in preventing COVID with its associated risk of hospitalization and death outweighed the risk of side effects. So we will see whether regulators and statistical modeling are in agreement or not. It's just a game. Next slide, please. So the benefit-risk balance is a very basic concept. We say that the benefit, individual or populational, because we have two aspects, expected from the use of a medicine, here a vaccine, should always be much greater than the risk incurred. It's a banality. Okay, but the statistical computation is in fact fairly complex for many reasons. For instance, the therapeutic effect is a pharmacological response expressed by almost all treated persons. In the case of vaccine, at least in the clinical trials, not in population, but at least in the clinical trials, we observe 65 to 95% positive response, that is to say, efficacy. But untoward effects are quite different. We have to keep in mind, to bear in mind, that probably most of untoward effects of medicines present on the market are not yet identified yet. There is a concern. These effects, these adverse effects, could have a low to extremely low probability of occurrence. And they occur only in certain persons when a certain number of risk factors or traits are present. And my colleague, deceased now, unfortunately, Dr. Winifred Kessel said, for this case, the drug is safe, but the patient is dangerous. Next slide, please. Okay. It is sad, it is very sad to observe how the basic principle of scientific evaluation has been forgotten since computers and bureaucracy have taken power. Here I show the first page of a book wrote by a French guy, a famous guy for French people, not for you, but Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, for the Royal Academy in France, in Germany, in England, in Sweden, and at Bologna. So at this time, Europe was scientific. In the second volume of this book, next slide, please, d'Alembert discusses the benefit risk of not the vaccine exactly, but variolation against smallpox. And he discussed the use of statistics to determine or to compute the benefit risk balance in a very modern manner and much more satisfactory that we have today from literature or, I don't know, experts in public health. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, some pages are difficult for non-statisticians, but next slide, please. I will present some of the points made by d'Alembert. First, so we know that he says that the benefit-risk balance generally differs for the person and for the population. Second, the vaccination imposes a risk of a possible risk of adverse drug reaction for all, while for a given person, the gain is hypothetical, random, because this person could have or could have not chance to be in contact with the virus, to be infected, and to develop or not severe form or death. So it is very important to keep to bear in mind when we compute benefit-risk balance. The third is the risk is fixed, one shot. For instance, here CVST, but the gain is incremental, increases over time if the vaccine or ear variolation protects lifetime. So we are protected. The gain is increasing when the age is, for a person, for instance, can be protected 20 years, for instance. And the fourth point is estimating benefit-risk balance for general population could be misleading. And generally, it's misleading to present a benefit-risk balance on average for the whole population, and could lead to inappropriate public health decisions because both risk and benefit generally greatly differ with age and often in opposite directions. And consequently, the gain-risk balance depends on the age at which the vaccination is practiced. And he introduced the life expectancy plays a major role in the calculation. I'm very sad to say that I never seen something like that recently. So we have to come back to the 18th century to learn modern pharmacoepidemiology for vaccine. Next slide, please. For instance, for age, from the excellent, so it's chauvinism, from the EPIPHAR study conducted the whole French population, we see the probability of death attributed to COVID according to the class of age. And it is a fantastic modifier of the risk because we have a ratio of more than 300 between the probability of dying when you are under 25 or when you are over 90. So it's an incredible modifier of the risk. Next slide, please. So the two questions for the benefits risk we have to address, it was the first, but we answered during the first part, was the occurrence of cases of CVST coincidental or not? And if we retain causal, does the benefit-risk balance of the vaccine remain excellent? And according to D'Alembert, for whom? Next slide, please. Okay, for the first question, we had the answer. For the second, unfortunately, too many uncertainties remain to compete with D'Alembert. So we are in the 21st century, so we are not as modern as in the 18th century. So many ingredients are missing for the computation. For instance, the duration of vaccine protection, we don't know. It could be 8 months, it could be 12 months, it could be 5 years, it could be lifetime, we don't know. The duration of the COVID pandemic, it could disappear now or be still present in 10 years, we don't know. The effectiveness of the vaccine against variants, present and future, and the possibility of having in hands safer other alternatives, vaccine or not, in the next future. Next slide, please. So in order to play with the statistics, I took the complete statistics of COVID deaths in France according to age. So you have the class of age on the left, the corresponding population on the second column. The third is the number of deaths since the beginning of the pandemic in France, that is to say 14 months. The death rate per 1,000 individuals. And at the extreme right, we have the risk of CVST, the baseline risk of CVST, it high in 1544 and very low over 74. So next slide, please. So I decide to spend my nights to play with the computers and the softwares in order to modelize what we would obtain if all the French population have been vaccinated by using, for instance, the AstraZeneca. So I'm chauvinist again. I take the example of France. And I assume 100% of the population immunized and with after 3 months we have 100%. It is completely unrealistic, but just for the play. I assume a protection of 80% by this vaccine. Is probably optimistic too. And I use a baseline risk for CVST, different according to age. And I work with data extracted from the literature, and this ranging for 22 per million and per year in 1544, and only 6 per million and per year over 74. And I assume a relative risk for, so it's purely an assumption, a relative risk of 1.5 for the risk of CVST induced by the vaccine. And I explore two scenarios. The first is for 1 year protection of all the population after a complete vaccination, that is to say 2 doses. And the second scenario is a 5-year protection. The virus stays here, and so the vaccine, we don't know, protects more than 5 years. Next slide, please. So we obtain the following results. We can see that, for instance, the benefit risk or balance, the benefit risk balance is not excellent for the 1544, because we would observe in this population 660 cases of cerebral thrombosis for 600 COVID deaths prevented in the 1 year scenario, and 3,000 or a little more than 3,000 deaths prevented in the 5-year scenario. At the opposite, the last line, for people over 74, we expect only 42 cases of attributable cerebral thrombosis for a huge number of deaths prevented by the vaccine. That is to say, almost 47,000 deaths for 1 year coverage, and a huge number of almost 300,000 for a coverage of 5 years. Next slide, please. To be clearer, I will present the same figures, but for 1 million for vaccinated people, for each million of vaccinated people, for 1 million, I would induce 22 cases of cerebral thrombosis, and I would avoid 20 deaths for the 1 year scenario, and 112 for the 5-year scenario, and the same at the last line. I will induce 6 CVST for each million people vaccinated, and I will prevent a huge number of deaths. So as you see, the benefit-risk balance is misleading when we present it as an average. We have huge differences for instance, a young woman and an old man like me. Next slide, please. So to summarize, if we assume that the vaccine is and will remain effective against variants, and without considering other associated ideas, known or unknown, the benefit-risk balance remain a priori very good, but with, for me, according to statistics, a clear concern for young adults, and perhaps particularly women, and perhaps using oral contraceptives, which could be a risk factor. In other adults, that is to say over 64, the benefit-risk balance to date remain excellent. And of course, you can say, why did you use prevented death and not prevention of hospitalization or long-lasting COVIDs, etc.? We can make exactly the same computation, but it was just an example. Next slide, please. Okay. This example concerns the benefit-risk balance at the individual level, but of course, it could be a priority to immunize young adults to stop the circulation and the replication of the COVID in the population and the generation of variants. So I consider the individual. And the other point is from vaccine affairs, we learn that a good communication is more important than statistics. And some fatal cases, for instance, in a healthy young woman, can kill the products, even the campaign, more surely than a brilliant computation. Next slide, I think the last slide, fortunately for you. Next, please. Okay, so my conclusion will be that statistics and modeling are a powerful tool for preparing and adjusting public health decisions. And results can be easily strengthened by sensitivity analysis, because when we have something unknown or unclear, for instance, for a rate of the baseline incidence, we can use the one high value, lower value, in order to review how the final results are altered or not. In the present case, it is difficult to go further in the absence of information on the age and sex distribution of the reported CVS cases, and on the distribution of the number of doses of vaccine by age group. I was very surprised that the European Medicine Agency was unable to provide the age distribution of people vaccinated. They say 25 million, but it will be extremely important to make more sensible calculation, to know how many people over 70, between 50 and 70, and so on. And I guess that the answer will come from a specific pharmacoepidemiologic study, and this study should be carried as soon as possible in order to be certain of the possible link between vaccination, maybe with the adenovirus family and the occurrence of CVST, and the magnitude of the relative risk, in order to be more precise for regulatory decision and the choice of the target population. Next slide, please. So I would like to thank you, grazie mille, for your attention. This is a view of my country, the Pays Basque. It is why my English is so poor, because I was born in the deep south of France, close to the Spanish border, speaking first French, Basque, and Spanish, and so I have to learn English to communicate with you and answer your question. Thank you, grazie mille ancora.
So I don't know how to thank you, Bernard, for your wonderful second part. Let me comment that it's probably the best hour we have had in the last month on COVID, probably this year. So thanks indeed. I truly thank you for the clarity, for the balance between the statistical analysis and the synthesis or capacity to give a judgment, and a sound one, combining common sense and difficult calculation, and put on esprit de finesse. Really appreciated. So I see also Giuseppe with us.
Yes.
So
yeah, it's my good friend Giuseppe. It's a long.
Well, it was a real pleasure, Bernard, to see your presentation. It was a wonderful presentation, and well, for you it clearly applies the idea you are a real maestro.
No.
Yes, you are.
No.
That's true.
No, è vero.
That's really true. Well, I have a question. What do you think, Bernard? With the same data and basically the same analysis, in the end, each country had different policies. is this something we should expect as a normal outcome, or should we consider this a kind of failure of experts, of regulators, of pharmacoepidemiologists, or what is your opinion?
I will make an exception for Italy, because I guess you are introducing science in the agency. We discussed this point with Dottore, Direttore, and many agencies have killed science and replace expertise by regulation and bureaucracy. And unfortunately, it is, for me, very dangerous for public health if the level of the science in the agency decreases. For instance, if I don't want to comment for Europe, but USA, for instance, with the Food and Drug Administration, was very attentive to maintain a very high level of expertise of science. They have something like 100 PhDs working in the agency in epidemiology, statistics, reviewing the cases. It's extremely important. So unfortunately, we know that Europe, I don't know the email, but Europe in general is weak because we give importance to bureaucracy more than common sense and science. So, and we have no made Europe, in fact, when we see that some country, Denmark, for instance, took, I don't know if it's probably justified, but a decision to postpone or to withdraw the use of AstraZeneca vaccine, when the European agency saying, oh, there is nothing, so the benefit-risk balance is good. It is very difficult for me to accept this. My explanation is that the science is disappearing and the expertise is disappearing. That is dangerous for the population, the European population. And the good sense is what you are doing to do, that is to say, to refer to science, to increase expertise, and I think it's a very good thing. I'm sorry, I am too frank. I will be in jail soon, but
we can always protect you, and please come here.
Yeah, thank you.
As a senior consultant.
Will bring me oranges. Okay.
So I have before referring to a couple of difficult questions for which I would like not to be responsible, but I will read them in a minute, and you probably have seen them. One general one, you made your very nice and exemplary calculation without reference to sex or to gender. Did you do it because of the lack of data? By the way, I can comment that Emma just requested yesterday the data of vaccine provision by age classes in all Europe for every state, because they were not available at central level, by the way. So what you were suggesting... Yeah,
but it is unbelievable. It is unbelievable. For me, it is unbelievable that we are 1 month after the start of this affair into Norway, Denmark, and we are just asking now the age and gender distribution of the dose used by country. It was the first information to get in order to have a precise calculation of the risk. But I agree with you.
I will not refer it to outside these 2,000 people listening.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm too. No. It's sorry.
No. Freedom is all, and freedom of good science, that, as you show, is truly, because this is the other element which I would like to comment with you before going to some of the questions. How do you think a proper reaction is between the pressure, the time, the emergency and the collection of good data, as you suggest. And you are also meaning probably or suggesting that the data collection can be feasible in a proper way, also under emergency condition, as you were probably just saying.
Yeah, I do think that conducting a good analysis, a good study, is not could be fast. For instance, I don't know the situation in Italy, but I am quite sure that you have networks, you have databases, and we can mix, for instance, the case we receive with an overview of the type of population vaccinated, and to make very interesting computation. And so within 2 or 3 weeks, or less maybe, we can have a good answer. In France, for instance, EPIFAR is working on the whole database of insurance system in order to have an answer about the risk the diseases associated with the use of vaccines. I think each country can contribute with the tools we have, and within a very short delay to provide very useful information for the regulators, because the regulators need information, because the pressure from the media, from the consumers, from the lawyers could be dangerous. So we need answers, and I think the transparency is always very important when we deal with vaccines. And so we need to say the truth and to present the facts. So it could be done very quickly.
Thank you.
Again, yes, well, again, to follow with difficult question from the audience, because I'm seeing here the one difficult question is what to do when we don't have enough data, like in the case of the second dose of AstraZeneca. Do you have any suggestions for?
No, common sense. For instance, if the second dose is very bizarre, because we were, for instance, in many countries, they say it's 3 weeks, 3 weeks, no more. Okay, plus or minus 1 minute. I don't know. Probably we can use a second dose after 1 month or more. And I don't know if we have to inject a second dose of AstraZeneca or a dose of Pfizer. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in immunology, but probably is equivalent, because the principle of vaccination is to generate antibodies, and if the first contact could be the disease or AstraZeneca, and the second could be AstraZeneca, Moderna, or Pfizer. Personally, I think it's common sense. If, for instance, a young lady received a dose of AstraZeneca, she is 35. The second dose, I will use another vaccine, for instance, by precautionary principle. It could be, for instance, a Pfizer. But in adults, old things like me, I will use the AstraZeneca for the second dose without any fear. So I'm not a woman, not using oral contraceptive. I have the double of 35, so I'm not very at risk of cerebral thrombosis.
Yeah, thank you.
So if I can comment, because it will stay with me at least, but I'm sure it will stay with us, your quotation of the vaccine is safe, but the patient is dangerous. This difficulty in identifying any risk factors, if not the well-known ones that are so widespread that I don't think they can be very predictive of such a rare risk. Don't you think, going back to your second dose suggestions, that if it is so linked to the patient, as you were suggesting with your clever quotation, shouldn't have happened at the depletion of the susceptible ones, so it could actually the second dose be much safer. I'm not an expert in
I agree. We don't know, for instance, for the Leiden, I don't know the pronunciation in Italian or in English, the Leiden factor it's probably, but it's extremely difficult to test it before. It was debated for the fourth and third generation pills. It could be a trait like this, maybe oral contraceptive, maybe tobacco. I don't know, because we don't have many information from the agencies. It will be very useful to have the details of the characteristic of the cases to answer the question.
Yeah, we are trying to collect a common database. Just to add some information useful to share with you, we set up a group of experts of coagulation, and they were suggesting that also factor V of Leiden is so prevalent, 4 or 5% of the population, that though well known, it cannot be a determinant given the rarity. And the other thing complicating our analysis also for the future is that though the German school of Professor Greinacher, who just published in the New England their case series, in Italy, our experts have shown that only half of the cases are positive to antiphospholipid 4 antibodies, meaning the HIT hypothesis, heteroinduced thrombocytopenia, seems to be true in half of the cases. So we're further complicating this association of not only CVSD plus thrombocytopenia, that is the seems to be in need of further exploration. So now one question that was coming from a colleague, Professor Mugelli, was suggesting to ask you, do you think it could be part of the new investment also from the recovery fund? We talk a lot in order to have better collaboration and better observational data for the studies you were suggesting. As it is not there, what do you think should be something we advise for?
I think it would be an excellent idea. The problem is, I don't know if I answer correctly to this question, but this could be used for developing collaboration and very modern and innovative studies to explore quickly and deeply this possible association. It is sad to see that, for instance, Europe is not, when I say Europe, I'm not speaking about the European agency, Europe in general, is not very active for setting up collaboration between member states. We have some projects from, I was a member of the ERC, the European Research Council. There's a lot of money here, but we need, for instance, to implement very, like task force of very clever, very acute persons in Italy, Spain, Germany, France, I don't know, the Netherlands, in order to try to provide modern approach for all the public health affairs or problem or concern we have in Europe. So I will support strongly the suggestion of the colleague too.
Bernard, you have conducted a lot of many studies, both comparing observed with expected and making formal pharmacoepidemiologic studies. In most of the cases, the final result is the same, with the exception that the pharmacoepidemiology, more formal pharmacoepidemiology study will be able to find out also associated risk factors to define subgroups and so on. In this case, would you expect any difference or from a pharmacoepi study when we will have the results? I hope in a few weeks or in a few months.
No, I don't know. So you are perfectly right when you say that the advantage of formal epidemiology or formal pharmacoepidemiology is just to isolate and subgroups and to show, to point out to point out some risk factors. We don't know, in fact, to date. So it's why we should conduct such a study. After I have no idea about the result of this study for the strength of the association between vaccine and the CVST. I took it was theoretical 1.5 for the relative risk because it was what we say for the oral contraceptive, the fourth generation. I don't know. I would be surprised if we find a threshold like 30 or 50. It would be something very okay. I don't know, but I do think that with large studies, conducted within databases, we have the statistical power to identify relative risk as low as 1.2 or 1. It wasn't the case when I was a baby, because we were conducting field studies, so we were limited to course studies to 1,000 people, so statistical power was very, very low or weak. But today we have chance to the possibility of conducting study within some weeks and to publish results, the average risk factors and the variation of the relative risk according to age, sex, comorbidities, and so on. And very useful for the regulator.
Thank you.
I would like to stress two things for the many people listening to this so interesting talk. How many times you, one of the best experts in the field, you were pronouncing "I don't know" or "we don't know," which I think is the most serious statement that a researcher can do when we don't know. And what do you think of the emphasis that the media have put in we should have all answers, or people anticipating decision based on no data and so forth? What is your advice on how to survive in this difficult circumstances?
Okay, I don't know, but vaccine and adverse events associated with, or possibly associated with vaccines, are my job for exactly 34 years. It began in France with anti-hepatitis B vaccine affair and multiple sclerosis. And I learned that, of course, media are always very interested in such affairs because nobody cares when people like me is killed by a drug. But for a young woman or for a young baby, it could be a big title for tabloids or the TV. And it is more, sorry to say that, signore direttore, but the media could be more efficient to kill a vaccine than a regulatory decision. And I think the weapon to protect drugs, vaccination, for instance, is probably transparency, to explain and just to give the facts and to explain. For instance, for AstraZeneca, to explain why, by precautionary principle, we are investigating the case, but for the moment, we will use it in people over, for instance, 60, what it could be. I think people are not stupid, but they understand this kind of explanation. And when they are confident with the health authorities, there is no effect on the campaign. But if we say things not exactly, or we see we do not provide exact information, or we are not transparent, we increase vaccine hesitancy. So I guess as a media are just a loudspeaker, an amplifier for the hesitation of our communication. So we have to be very, very straight, transparent, and probably it will work.
Yeah.
Please, Giuseppe.
Well, we have a question from a common friend,
Yes.
Joan Ramon Laporte. Well, he's asking.
He is from Barcelona.
From Barcelona, so he is watching you. Pay attention, because, well, anyway, the Professor Laporte is asking whether anyone in France, Italy, or other countries are looking at hospital admission for diagnosis of rare thrombosis, intravascular coagulation disseminated, and thrombocytopenia, and so on, before the pandemic, during and afterwards. Well, as far as I know, at least in Italy, there are pharmacoepi studies going on, and I'm sure also in other countries these kind of studies are on their way. So I assume that, in fact, that was I was saying before, in 1 or 2 months, I assume at least 1 or 2 studies will have some results that will be shared with the community, and we will see. I don't know. I don't know the situation in France.
No, in France it would be the same, because we have with the large database with, for instance, EPIFA, we have the hospital diagnosis, so we could the same. But the Professor Laporte is quite right. So I totally agree with it. It could be simple, quick, and very informative to do so.
Thank you.
As we are abusing of your time and the energy,
no.
In 5 minutes we are going to close. But I truly appreciated your mentioning the strength of the FDA. We all know how strong they are, by underlining the fact that with 100 PhD student expertise, you can make at least 100 in-depth studies. What's your view on how to plan for the future? Should we be more collaborative among existing networks, your centers, Barcelona, Italy, Gianni Corra and others, Istituto Superiore di Sanità? Or do you think the agency, as I start to think, should be able to build also within their staff some capacity to be full analyst of difficult data set that currently we need to explore in more detail? What's your view, as you can have a distant perspective, much more clear than us?
Okay. As it is a wonderful day with sunshine and good temperature, I will answer both. I guess it is important that each agency has inside a capacity of interpreting data, to explore, to give expertise very quickly, a very robust expertise and calculation. One side, and the other side, it will be very important to have a network like the one you described. But just to be a prehistoric, unfortunately, 20 years ago, it was the case. We have, in many countries, we had very good staff, statistician, for instance, and pharmacologists and so on in the agencies, and European networks. For instance, I remember one conducted by Professor Michael Rollins. Professor Laporte was a part of this network, a very active part. So both existed, and progressively we have killed this kind of experience, and we pay the price now. So I think it's very important to have people, teams inside the agency, and to promote by, we have the money, money is not a concern, to have very active networks in order to give answer in a case like this one. So my answer will be both.
Well, thank you very much.
No, grazie mille, grazie mille.
It was an incredible pleasure to see you and to hear you and to listen to your wonderful presentation.
Yes.
I hope the 10,000 people connected will switch off after 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
They can switch off. Also here there is nice weather. They can go for a walk and think. That is what you have promoted. Let me give you a quotation back, as you gave as a couple so nice. And truly thank you for your how to say, for your grace, for your capacity to remain, with reflecting while calculating. You told us that you come from the border of Spain and France, and from the Basque countries. And I think I'm glad to dedicate you a wonderful statement by Fernando Aramburu, who recently stated that when he was asked, who do you belong to? He lives in Germany, but was born in Basque and Spanish. So what is your nationality? And he said, I belong to the country very large, without borders, made of the good men. I think you are not just a wonderful professor, but you are truly a good man.
Aramburu, the translation is the entrance of the valley. Aramburu. Buru is head. Okay, thank you.
So let me quote also Edgar Morin. You have a nice head. It's called head. Yeah? So I think we'll call you again, as we will probably call Juan Ramon in our next meeting. And thank you, Giuseppe, for the idea. His merit and his fault if he has made you work so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you to everybody.
Ok.
Grazie mille.
Grazie mille, veramente.
A bientôt.
Ciao, a presto.
Presto.